Hi, welcome to this webinar on RoHS. So I hope you find easily the right link. We actually did a trial on the previous link. So I'm very thrilled to be here with you and share one of my favorite topic, which is RoHS. So everything you wanted to know on RoHS, we'll try to address as much information as possible. Here's the different topics we're gonna cover today. The EU RoHS regulation, the scope, the certification itself. What does it mean to be RoHS compliant? The exemption list, technical documentation, RoHS regulations worldwide. There is also a bonus question we all wonder. We'll discuss that as well. You will see what it is. The future of RoHS, beyond RoHS, and anytime, please use the chat. Send your questions, comments, and I will try to address your questions. If you have specific questions, you can also send me an email at info@enviropass.ca, especially if it's something that is very specific to your products or anything like that. So before starting, who is Enviropass? Enviropass is a consulting company dedicated in the field of product environmental compliance. So we do RoHS consulting, of course. Also, we cover REACH, California Prop 65, conflict minerals, POP, ELV, everything that is related to product environmental requirements. We are specialized in electrical devices, but we also cover other products. You can follow us on LinkedIn, and you will have access to the most recent news in this field. So you can follow Enviropass page on LinkedIn, and we also have a YouTube channel. By the way, this presentation will be on the YouTube channel, so you could share it to your colleagues. And other presentations are on this channel as well, so you are welcome to join it. Also, we have prepared the online course on product environmental compliance, which covers RoHS, REACH, other requirements. So it's an introduction to product environmental compliance. The price is very decent, so it's around 40 Canadian dollars. Online course of about 3 hours course. So feel free to register and to get like a roadmap, broader point of view of what may apply to your products, what different requirements exist, and how they apply to your products. I am Ori. I am a certified environmental auditor. I've been doing this kind of business for over 10 years now. Any questions, you can email me at info@enviropass.ca. This is not an exhaustive presentation, but we will describe the situation with respect to RoHS right now at this time. So EU RoHS. EU RoHS is under Directive 2011/65/EU, and we're still under RoHS 2. So sometimes you see in the literature what we're talking about RoHS 3, but in reality we are under RoHS 2. RoHS 3 actually refers to one of the main amendments, which is the amendment 2015/863. But in reality, this is RoHS 2, RoHS recast. There are actually 2 versions. First version was in 2002. This version is over and has been replaced by the Directive 2011/65/EU. And there are 40-ish amendments since 2011. The biggest amendment is the one of 2015, but be aware that there are another 40-ish amendments. So that this regulation evolves. It's not static. So the directive of 2011/65/EU is called the Directive on the Restriction of the Use of Certain Hazardous Substances in Electrical and Electronic Equipment. So that's where you see the acronym of RoHS for restriction, the R, of certain hazardous. So off is for the O, hazardous for the H, substances for the S, RoHS. And this is specifically in electronic equipment. 2011, the idea of RoHS was to get a broader scope, a very broad scope. Actually, last year, we had the comprehensive scope. So every product that would be listed under RoHS would have to be RoHS compliant. There are a couple of exclusions. We're going to discuss that. But mainly professional, consumer products, they all are in the scope. And another important news for RoHS 2 was the CE marking. So as when you CE mark a product, or if you see CE mark on an electronic device, this actually means that the product is RoHS compliant if it's in the scope. So it's kind of signature. So if you CE mark your product, you're actually saying, among other things, that your product is RoHS compliant. So it better be true. What about the scope? Scope of RoHS. So are you in the scope? That's the question. And you need to look at the Article 2 of RoHS. And you will see the reference to the Annex 1, where you have product categories. And you will see whether or not you fall into these product categories. And typically you will, because the last category is any electronic equipment. So if you don't find your product is in the different categories, like, for example, medical devices, other category is monitoring instrument. If you don't see your product there, well, you will fall eventually in the last category. So RoHS would apply to you, except if your products are solely for military purposes, for example, aerospace, automotive, because you have another regulation for automotive devices, automotive products, which is the ELV regulation, end-of-life vehicles. Unless you manufacture batteries, because there is a battery directive, or packaging, it's out of scope of RoHS scope. It's under the packaging directive. Other than that, you have a few other exemptions that are listed in the Article 2 of the directive. Also, it's important to pay attention to the Article 3, because under the Article 3, you will see some definitions. What is an electrical equipment? What is a large-scale tool? What scale installation tool or fixed installation device? What it is? Actually, we have a definition in the Article 3, and the European Commission has published FAQ in this regard that may help you find out whether or not your product falls in this exclusion, because large-scale stationary industrial tools are excluded, for example. So let's say you have a device that is used in a large-scale tool, you may be excluded, but it has to be only for this type of tool. So if it's used for both different type of tools, not necessarily large-scale, then you will be in the scope of RoHS. Don't hesitate to enter any questions anytime. and I will be glad to answer them. Here's the list under the Annex 1 of the scope. So you see large house appliances, small house appliances, IT equipment, consumer equipment, lighting equipment. You also have electrical, electronic tools, toys, medical devices, monitoring control instruments, including industrial ones. All of that is in the scope right now. Even last one, other EEE. EEE is for electrical, electronic equipment. So since last year, even if you are under the other part of it, well, you are in the scope. Oh, question from Andrew. Examples of large-scale tools. Very good question. Okay, a large-scale tool needs to be very large. I mean, very, like more than a fridge. If you look at the FAQ, it has to be bigger than a container, like a truck container. So, and it has to be installed by professionals only. Also, there are some weight threshold. So you need to exceed the weight threshold. Look at the FAQ from the European Commission. If you don't have it, I can send it to you, Andrew. You will see they give you some guidelines. We also provide opinion letters. We have some customers that were on the fence, not sure whether or not their product are excluded. We will verify that for you. This was, so some categories were excluded. The last category was excluded last year in July 23rd, which was the category 11. So right now, any product, almost any product. There are few exemptions also for medical devices, but most of them would fall in the scope. Now, what is the certification? How do you get your product certified? We are going to discuss this at the end, throughout this presentation. But what you need to get at the end of your product assessment is a DOC, a Declaration of Conformity, which will be part of your CE DOC, CE Declaration of Conformity. Oh, I have a question. Can we get this presentation? Yes, we will send you the presentation by email, so you will get the presentation as well. And the DOC, the Declaration of Conformity, should be should contain the wording that are indicated in the Annex 6 of the RoHS directive. For example, you need to have some specific details that are listed here. You need to specify that this declaration is issued under the sole responsibility of the manufacturer, for example. Refer exactly your product, what type of product. And very important, indicate the standards that you use to prepare your technical file and your Declaration of Conformity. And typically that will be the IEC 63000. We're gonna discuss that later. And also the exemptions. We will see that your product can be RoHS compliant without any exemption. It can also be RoHS compliant with some exemptions. For complex products like yours, you would typically have at least a couple of exemptions. Exemptions that allow lead above the threshold for some specific applications. Let's say for ceramic of some capacitors, you would need lead above the regular threshold. We're gonna discuss that later on. What does it mean to be RoHS compliant, which is definitely the main question. If you look at the directive itself under Article 4, you will have the reference to an annex, Annex 2. And this Annex 2 gives a list of substances with threshold. This is the list of substances. 6 substances. 6 substances with a threshold of 1000 ppm part per million, which is equivalent to 0.1%, for 4 heavy metals: lead, mercury, cadmium, hexavalent, chromium, except cadmium. Cadmium is only 100 ppm, so 10 times lower concentration, 0.01% per material. And there are also 2 brominated compounds, PBB, PBDE. They are used in plastics, typically in PVC plastics, maybe rubber, maybe other type of plastics, typically PVC plastics. And the threshold is the same as the other substances, 1000 ppm, 0.1%, except for cadmium. Now, since 2015, 4 other substances have been added to this list. So if you look at the original version of the Directive 2011, you won't see these 4 phthalates, 4 additional substances that are phthalates: BBP, DBP, DHP, DIBP. The threshold is the same, 0.1%. And this applies since 2019, since last year, for most product categories, except 2 exclusions. 2 exclusions for medical devices. So if you manufacture medical devices, you're still in a grace period until next year, July 22nd. By the way, most of the time, the regulatory changes for RoHS apply in July. And monitoring control instruments are also excluded for the phthalate, not for the 6 first substances, not for lead, mercury, cadmium, etc., but only for the 4 phthalates. You can still use them as much as you want until next year. So you just have 1 year to correct the situation to make sure that your product will still pass next year. This means that a product that is compliant today is not necessarily compliant next year. So you need to keep your technical file up to date to make sure that you will remain compliant. That's it about this. So where are these substances likely to be found? For lead, you would find them also in PVC plastics. You will see PVC is a pet peeve in terms of product environmental compliance, because you may have many additives. And when we say lead, it's not only pure lead. Usually it's not pure lead. It's lead and lead compounds, like monoxide of lead, for example. You will see them also in glasses, in screens, in fuses, the glass of fuses, in solder, obviously. So be careful, because if you verified your oil bomb, that's very good. But you also need to include your consumables, like solder, pasting, painting, that may not be RoHS compliant. And as discussed, you also have lead in ceramics. And there are a couple of exemptions for lead in ceramics, for example. What about mercury? Mercury, you will find it in displays, interestingly enough, in fuse, also in batteries, even if it's out of the RoHS scope. But for the battery directive, it's important to know. Different other devices. Cadmium, interestingly enough, cadmium is used in plastics. If you have a color like a pigment, a color from yellow to red, it may contain cadmium. There are actually many replacement, other colorant, but the industry used to use cadmium. Same thing for PVC. Cables may contain cadmium. Also in connectors, because we would use cadmium as a finish, as a coating in connectors. For its physical properties, it's useful, it's interesting to get cadmium. Chromium hexavalent, so it's not every type of chromium, just the hexavalent form of it, used, for example, as a finish. Normally, it's replaced by a trivalent form of chromium, but the trivalent is slightly more expensive. So some companies that are not familiar with RoHS, or they sell only for, let's say, for aerospace industries, they may still use chromium hexavalent. So we will need to make sure that you actually have a chromium hexavalent part, not chromium trivalent, sorry, not a chromium hexavalent. And again, for cadmium, for mercury, it's not only the pure form of cadmium or mercury, it's also every compounds. PBB, PBDs are family, and they are used as flame retardants. So you expect them in plastics. And the 4 new phthalates we just discussed, DEHP, BBP, DBP, DIBP, are individuals that are typically found in plastic, PVC plastics again, but all the type of plastics possibly, and also in rubber. Why these substances? Hazardous for the environment, for public health as well. Lead, it's very well known. If you have too much lead in water, it's a neurotoxic. Other substances are also carcinogen, mutagen, reprotoxic, and that's why we try with RoHS to reduce the amount, the usage of these substances. The level, as discussed, is 0.1% for all of them, except cadmium, 0.01%, and the percentage applies at the homogeneous material level. And this is a very important key concept, key information, because let's say someone tells you, okay, my product is RoHS compliant, lead is below 0.1%. Is it 0.1% of the whole device? No, it's for every material within the device, within the component. So that's the most important information you will need to remember from this presentation, that it applies at the homogeneous material level. What does it mean? A homogeneous material is defined in the directive as a material of uniform composition throughout, or a material consisting of a combination of materials that cannot be disjointed or separated into different materials by mechanical actions, such as unscrewing, cutting, crushing, grinding, or abrasive processes. What does it mean? It means, let's say you have a resistor, quite a simple part, but you will still have different homogeneous materials, for example, the connecting lead, the end cap, ceramic substrate, carbon film. Maybe you have five different materials in this resistor. So this means every single material need to meet the requirement of 0.1% for the 10 substances and 0.01 for the other. Actually 0.1 for 9 substances and 0.01% for the other one. What about a lead simple part? Same thing, different materials, maybe five-ish different homogeneous materials in it. Ceramic capacitor, a capacitor, different materials, up to a dozen of materials. A cable, same thing. Don't forget screws, mechanical parts, custom parts, all of this needs to be RoHS compliant. And actually, we find a lot of cadmium in some finishes of screws. Some finishes, like for example, a zinc finish may contain cadmium above the threshold, depending on the type of finish that is used. So it's very important for you to make sure that the whole assembly, the whole product is RoHS. There is no de minimis. Nothing can be excluded except batteries packaging, because they have other restrictions, other regulation directive that is stricter. And it's more demanding. So there is no possible exemptions, for example. So what do you do when you have an assembly, a sub-assembly like this one? You may have 30 different components, maybe 150 homogeneous materials. How do you make sure that all of these materials meet the requirements? Are you going to test 100 multiplied by 10? So that would be 1,500 tests. It will cost you an arm and a leg. There is actually another option. We're going to discuss that. Especially for complex products like yours, maybe your BOM may contain 150 components, maybe over 7, maybe over 1,000 homogeneous materials. What are you going to do with that? And even if you would make, let's say you dismantle this assembly, and you find a way of getting every tiny single homogeneous material. Let's say you analyze them, then you will have destroyed your product. First of all, maybe costly. The testing itself will be very, very costly. And you would just have a picture of the compliance of this product. You won't get any commitment from your suppliers. So let's say this supplier, new batch. Let's say you change a supplier. Let's say you change a source. What do? You don't have a guarantee that the new source is RoHS compliant. So are you going to do another test? That's not reasonable. There is another option. On top of it, there is exemptions. So let's look at the exemptions. You can access the exemptions from our website, enviropass.ca/Europe RoHS. So if you go on the website, maybe I can share that with you. So you would go on enviropass.ca, and you will have access. If you go under services, RoHS, EU RoHS, then you would have access to the exemption list. So let's download the general exemption list. It's important for you to get up-to-date exemptions because the exemptions are updated regularly. Actually, they are reviewed and they have expiration dates. So if you look, for example, very popular exemptions, the 6A1, 6A, 6A1, 6A for lead in steel alloys. You can have lead in steel alloys above the threshold. So feel free to download these documents if you want to look at them. There is also some general specific exemptions to medical devices. So medical devices benefit from general exemptions plus specific exemptions. Control instruments, same thing. So you have 40-ish general exemptions plus specific exemptions you may benefit from. Medical devices, I give you an example. You go to the dentist, take a radio. Well, you need lead to protect the dentist, from radiations. So there is an exclusion for some shields in lead. Now, if I go back to the presentation here. So we will keep you up to date. If you follow us on LinkedIn, that's probably the best way to keep updated. And let's say an exemption expire. What do? You need to contact your suppliers for this exemption and ask them, well, do they have the new exemption, or are they able to update their statement and provide a statement without this exemption? Or maybe you would have to find a new source. 6C is an exemption that is very popular. Copper alloy containing lead up to 4%, not above, but up to 4% of this specific copper. You will need to list this exemption in your technical file. Some exemptions have expired. For example, the 7C3, which had lead in dielectric ceramic in capacitors for low voltage. It's no longer possible to benefit from this exemption. So let's say you collected the declaration of conformity from a couple of years ago, it's no longer valid if it claimed this exemption. It has been totally removed. Some exemptions are split. This should be reflected in your declaration of conformity. So the homogeneous material level, very important information, and the exemption status, another very important key concept under RoHS. If you understand these two key concepts, you can navigate through RoHS quite easily. Here is an exemption that is very popular, lead in steel, up to 0.35%. It has been replaced last year by 6A1. Lead, so the beginning is exactly the same, but they added a new restriction. And in batch hot dip galvanized steel components containing up to 0.2% lead by weight. Every 5 years, by default, these exemptions are revised, are up to date, but it could happen every time, anytime. It's by default every 5 years they are reviewed and eventually changed. So your technical documentation should reflect these details on the exemptions. You should actually, if you look at the regulation under the Article 7, the directive says that the manufacturer must draw up a technical documentation and carry out internal production procedures. So you need to have procedures in place to explain how you verify your product. Where is your technical file? What does it contain? Do you have a quality assessment? How do you make sure the information you've gathered is okay, is enough? And they also detail that in the directive that manufacturers must ensure these procedures are in place for series production to remain in conformity. Because the regulation changes all the time, your design change. Your designs change. So let's say you find a new source, you find a new part, etc. It should be reflected in your procedures, in your technical documentation. You need to keep the information for 10 years. So let's say you change the model, you have to keep to be able to demonstrate compliance for the last 10 years. We got a question about machines, power tools. Well, unless they would be a large-scale tool, they would fall under RoHS. May benefit from exemptions, may benefit from, if they are monitoring instruments, for example, then this may benefit from a specific exemption. But if they are just machines like power tools, typically the general exemptions would apply for the whole product, unless it's considered as a large-scale tool. In that case, you would be totally excluded from RoHS. If it's not that big, let's say it's as big as a table. If it's an assembly line, let's say it's part of the assembly line. If it's part of the assembly line, it will still be in the scope, unless it cannot be dismantled, like it can be worked solely. Other question: if the design changes, do we need to get revised conformity? Well, very good question. The quick answer is yes. You will need to make sure that your technical file is up to date. So what I suggest, what I recommend is anytime you purchase a new part, anytime you actually consider a new part, verify whether or not it's RoHS compatible. Anytime you find a new subcontractor for a new design, verify within your contractual arrangements that they will provide you RoHS compliant parts, so you won't have any bad surprises. So you have two sources of possible information to build your technical file, to do your assessment. One is the analytical testing, meaning chemically testing every homogeneous material. And the other option is documentary review. And for complex products, like the power tools, for example, go with the documentary review, meaning you will gather the information from your supply chain. Because your suppliers have simpler parts, more simple parts, and their supplier has very simple parts. So if you go down to supply chain, you, at the end of the day, you would go to a smelter, for example, of aluminum bars. Aluminum bars is just one homogeneous material, very easy to test, to do chemical testing. So why don't you benefit from the tests that has already been done by your suppliers or the supplier of your suppliers? Then you would gather their documents. You need not a chemical testing from them. That's not what you want. You don't want a test report, because a test report is just a sample. What you want is a commitment from your suppliers via a certificate of compliance or a declaration of compliance, a commitment from them. And you need to make sure that this certificate of compliance is up to date, is comprehensive, covers your part, cover the information about the exemptions, very important. So the analytical testing is not that difficult if you have just one homogeneous material that you could use X-ray fluorescence, send it to a lab. They will test. In this example, with the X-ray gun, they would test copper and verify the heavy metals, especially lead in copper. This is possible. Now, if you have multiple homogeneous materials, as discussed, it will be harder, very hard. And also, if you want to test the phthalates or the PBB, PBDs, you need to go into all the testing that are more costly. So definitely use the documentary approach by default. First, don't do this testing for your complex products, but ask your supply chain, ask your suppliers to provide you with certificate of compliance. And you would use typically the standard IEC 63000, or that's the same, the European 50581. This standard has been designed for complex products. So the European Union is totally aware that it's impossible to test all of these substances, but they will recommend the documentary approach. Oh, I see a question. Do we need a certificate of material compliance for components that are by design not containing regulated chemicals, such as known steel grade or natural materials such as wood, cotton? No. The answer is no if you are absolutely sure. If you have the, let's say it's an aluminum part, you have the aluminum alloy, you can verify the aluminum alloy material content, and you can verify yourself, make sure, okay, this part does not contain any RoHS substances. Let's say on your drawing sheet, you specify exactly the alloys, the specification, the military or ASTM alloy, then you would archive actually this drawing sheet as a proof of compliance. But if you have a finish, same thing. You need to specify exactly the finish on the drawing. Some drawings say, oh, this part must be RoHS compliant. It's not sufficient. My opinion, from my standpoint, I'm telling you it's not sufficient to demonstrate compliance. If it only says, oh, this part is RoHS compliant, it's RoHS compliant. It's not sufficient. Where is the exemption status? If it only says RoHS, are we talking about EU, China, we're going to see that there are different RoHS regulations. So it's important to pay attention to that. So the answer, Etienne, is yes, if you are sure. If you are sure, if you know exactly every material in your product. So the IEC 63000 says the technical documentation should be used for complex products. Since its introduction, it says actually it's impractical for manufacturers of complex products to undertake their own testing of all materials. Instead, manufacturers work with their suppliers to manage compliance and compile technical documentation as evidence of compliance. And that's really the idea. This approach is well recognized by both the industry and enforcement authorities. Well, does it mean you will never do XRF analysis or any chemical testing? No. The answer is no, but only as a last resort, you would do it. And you would target a specific material that you have not received any confirmation from your supplier, and you are stuck with this material because you don't have any alternative source. It's a kind of monopoly. You cannot find other sources. What do? Well, your supplier should have done the testing. He should have done the job. He doesn't do it, well, you would do it. And you will hope that it would pass. But what do? You will have a program, testing program you would do every month, maybe every week, every year, it depends. Just making sure that the product is still compliant. So the idea is, first of all, you do the documentary review. You collect the information from your supply chain for all of your parts in your BOM, including consumables. Then you do a risk assessment according to the IEC 63000. So you verify the likelihood, the chances of having any of substances above the threshold. You verify, if you look at the standard, you would verify the likelihood of getting substances, hazardous substances in the material. Is the risk low, medium, high? And also the chances that this supplier, it's a trustworthy supplier. So you would verify the trustworthiness. Let's say they have an ISO 14000 management system. So they already have an environmental management system in place. This may be considered as a medium or a low risk compared to another suppliers that don't have anything, no policy on RoHS, nothing about ISO 14000, just the ISO 9000 for quality, for example. This would raise the risk. So based on your risk assessment plus the documentary review, you will define whether or not you need to replace some sources for non-compliant parts or high-risk parts, or perform analytical testing. Let's say you cannot replace a source, then you would do the testing yourself, but just for a specific substance, not the whole product, just a couple of, maybe one. Typically, most of my customers, we don't even have to do it. We add a couple of times, but most of the time, we don't even have to do any analytical testing because they were able to replace the source or to gather sufficient information. Let's say at the end, you do the testing, there is a high-risk part, it doesn't pass. Then you will need to do corrective action of the design. But as a last resort, you don't want to do that. It barely happens. So that's it about EU RoHS. This is the gist in a nutshell of what is EU RoHS. Now you have other regulations worldwide. China, it's different. Different marking, different threshold, different rules. Some similarities, but different rules. So if you export your product to China and you say, oh, I am EU RoHS, very good. But you need to make sure that you have a table, technical file, also for China. It will help you, but the rules are slightly different. And there are other regulations everywhere now in the world. Even in California, they have a California RoHS. In New Jersey, in the United Arab Emirates, with other some similarities, but the obligation to have an audit from a local agency. Taiwan, same thing, depending on your product. Turkey, you need to register every year in Turkey and provide your certificate of compliance. Russia and some neighboring countries just have issued a RoHS-like regulation, and also it has to go with the local agency. Ukraine has a RoHS regulation. New Jersey, Oman, Brazil. Brazil is actually drafting one, and other countries as well. Okay, 49 people are with us. Very good. So you deserve a bonus question. What if you get caught? That's the question we all wonder. What if you get caught? Let's say your product is actually not RoHS compliant. There are different powers of enforcement. Making test purchases, inspect goods at the border. The surveillance agencies can seize, detain your products, ask for documents. If the documents are not consistent, they would perform some analytical tests themselves. They would take the gun, typically, the XRF the gun, and make some samples on parts. And if it doesn't pass, well, they would prohibit the product. If you have not listed the exemption, they may prohibit the product also, withdraw it from the market, from the EU market, or from any other market. Same thing for China, Taiwan, etc., Korea as well. You may also have to issue a recall notice, meaning you will have to ask your customers to send back the product and correct the situation free of charge. There is a website called RAPEX, which is managed by the European Commission. On this website, you will see some consumer products that are not RoHS compliant. Only consumer products, but professional industrial products are also targeted. They are not on RAPEX, but they are also targeted. This is one example, lead, typically lead in solders for this USB cable. Caught just this year by Sweden. Another example here, plastic contain SCCP. This is not regulated under RoHS, but under REACH. So there are also other regulations like REACH, POP, that applies in the European Union. So let's say you are RoHS compliant, that's very good. But you also need to comply with every product environmental requirements in Europe. Lead also was above the threshold for this multimeter, and it has been withdrawn from the market, not complying. This mouse, same thing. This adapter, lead, cadmium, above threshold. No exemption were declared, was withdrawn from the market by Slovenia. You see, it's Slovenia who found it. Slovenia found it, but it was withdrawn from the whole European market. Same thing here. Here. And the European Union is aware that many products actually don't pass. And they have issued a new regulation last year to increase surveillance for RoHS, REACH, the battery directive, and packaging directive. This means that we expect more surveillance. Next year, they are supposed to send, every member state in the European Union would have to send a report to Brussels to say how it goes. If it's improving, how many, like a percentage of products that didn't pass, etc. Question, can a once prohibited product return to the market if changes are done to correct the situation? Yes. Yes, as long as you update your technical file, you demonstrate that you have corrected the situation, you would be able to go back to return the product. However, it's very costly in terms of image. especially for your customers. Products block stock at the border. You have to pay every day. It's stuck at the border. Plus, if you have a recall notice, it's super expensive. So, but the answer is yes. You are not withdrawn from the market forever. Thankfully, some very big companies like Canon got issues in the past, but we still have Canon products that have been corrected since then. What is the future of RoHS before I let you go? The future is maybe the true RoHS 3 with the addition of any of these substances. Not before 2023. The TBBP-A and MCCPs have been recommended already. The other substances are still under investigation. So we will know. So far, we don't know. Maybe we will stay with 10 substances, maybe 12, maybe more. Maybe it will be a RoHS recast number 3, third version, or maybe it will just be an amendment of the current RoHS regulation. And also the exemptions are currently continuously revised. So this is for sure. Oh, other question. How expensive? Do you have examples? You mean, I'm not sure about the question. If you are talking about some chemical testing, it can go from, let's say it's one homogeneous material for lead, only that, $200. So it may go from $200 to thousands of dollars per homogeneous material. If you do, so it's way better to do use the IC 63000 approach, documentary approach, and then you would gather the information from your suppliers. You benefit from the test they did, but you ask them for a certificate of compliance, make sure it contains the exemption status, all of the information. Enviropass, we help you with this. So if you send us the BOM, we would verify. We'll contact your suppliers and make sure that the documents are up to date. We'll do the risk assessment. We'll verify all of that for you on your behalf for a very tiny portion of the price. Was about being caught at the border. Oh, the penalties if you're caught at the border are not too expensive. Talking about dozens of thousands of dollars, not too expensive. What is really expensive, it damages your image. And the recalls are very expensive because you have to pay like for every product going back to Canada or to the US and modify the design, modify the product. In that terms, it's very expensive in this sense. How to face these amendments? Well, we have developed at Enviropass a form. It's totally free. You can use it at your best convenience. So if you would go under the website, product compliance form, and you would open the form. It's an Excel form. And in this form, you would have EU RoHS details. So if you are not too sure what type of information you need to gather, send this form to your supplier, ask them to fill in the form, as long as it's well filled in with the exemption details, if it's the part is EU RoHS without exemption, with exemptions, or not compliant. You have different tabs, also one for EU REACH. We may discuss EU REACH in a coming webinar. POP, Prop 65, battery packaging. And you will keep, archive this document as a proof, as a certificate of compliance, maybe along with other details, depending on the part. Yeah, funny comment, Andrew. That's right. Beryllium copper gasket were best for EMC. So Andrew from NEMCO, we have a very good partnership with NEMCO. Andrew is an expert in safety EMC for your products based in Ottawa. and we work together also for RoHS. So that's right. Maybe some gaskets may change in the future. Other comment: can a product be recalled banned because it was not updated? Yes, absolutely. Let's say your product was compliant last year, and some exemptions have changed, have been updated. You didn't know, you were not aware. Well, unfortunately, your product is no longer valid this year, and you may. What the surveillance authority may ask is your technical file. First of all, your declaration of conformity. If your declaration of conformity does not contain the exemption status, they will ask for more details, technical file. That's why I highly recommend to have the exemption status directly, immediately on the declaration of conformity. Beyond RoHS, a constellation of many regulations. You see, EU RoHS, it's about restriction of substances in products, but you have so many other regulations. REACH is a mix of restriction of substances in products or declaration of substances in products. If you want to know more about these different regulations, I highly encourage you to go on our online course, which is managed by the RoHS Academy platform. So you would go, you would register, and get more details on these different regulations. It's an introduction. It will give you like a broad image, broad picture. And that was it for today. So if you have any other questions, feel free to post them. We still have 3 minutes, so I can answer right away. Or send it by email. You can send it by email at info@enviropass.ca. I will also send you this presentation so that you can keep it in your records. This YouTube Live will also be available, so you can share it with your colleagues. So thank you very much for your time, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.